Gilgamesh has been a very potent pick in casual so far and will make his way into ranked in the next patch, and that's why today we're talking about countering Gilgamesh. Ahoy, my name is Duke and I will tell you some different ways in which you can deal with the new warrior, no matter where you encounter him. We're going over some items, some relics, some playstyle strategies, as well as some counter picks. Let's begin with the items. The most effective counter that pretty much everyone can use is Winged Blade. This may sound a little bit counterintuitive because this item comes with magical protection, but it actually works very well against Gilgamesh due to the fact that so much of his kit relies on slows. His 1 is a slow, his ultimate is a slow, and you can get out of it very easily when you have the Winged Blade proc. And his 2, while his blink is down, frequently relies on him using his slow first to set it up properly, so if you speed up in that moment instead, he might not be able to get his 2 off in a way where he would lock you down. Since this is very important for his combo and sets up a lot of his damage, this really hinders him. You can of course more specifically counter Gilgamesh's knockback by getting Magi's Cloak as well, but the problem here is that the cooldown of Magi's Cloak is significantly longer, and quite often it will not be enough to fully counter an ability like Gilgamesh 2, which has a very short cooldown. If it's not you yourself who is suffering from this damage but you want to help your teammates, then Witchblade is a very effective choice. Not only does it come with the right type of protection, physical protection, but he also almost always uses some basic attacks to take a target down, and slowing down this time to kill by reducing its attack speed is just a very effective measure. In the same sense, you can also build Midgardian Mail or Frostbound Hammer depending on if he attacks you or if you're able to attack him, but it's worth keeping in mind that both of these are generally harder to apply to an enemy than Witchblade is. The benefit are the added movement speed slows though, which again are very effective to make it harder for him to set up his combo with his 2. Technically, Height of the Numeral 9 should also work well against him, since absorbing basic attacks works well against both his attack cancels as well as being a countermeasure to his pull in the ultimate, which will not happen if you absorb the basic attack. The problem is that Height of the Numeral 9 is generally not a very effective or stat efficient item at the moment. Due to mobility being so significant for him, as a hunter, Wind Demon is a decent choice against him, and so is Poison Star, even though it's not really used that much at the moment. However, if you're more specifically looking to deal more damage to him, then Kinsai is a great choice because he will often opt into significant amounts of health in order to get more damage out of his 1. Now obviously these aren't direct counters to the same degree, but they are most certainly useful in dealing with him. When it comes to relics, there are a few good choices. The first one is much like Winged Blade, Heavenly Wings. If he drops his ult on your team and you pop that, your entire team can just run out and pretend that ult never happened. Now obviously some characters need other defensive relics. Purification Beads works well against him because his 2 has a bit of a wind up, so you can use it against the knockback of his 2 and then avoid the stun entirely, and it also allows you to get out of his ultimate. The same is true for Aegis Amulet. You can avoid the damage from his 2, though you will still get knocked back and stunned, or you can get out of his ultimate without getting pulled back at all, since Aegis will prevent you from being knocked back. You will only be slowed a little bit. Currently upgraded Shell still counters the knockback from his ultimate as well. That should no longer be the case with the next patch, where the upgrade will give you damage reduction against basic attacks instead, but it should still be a decent item against Gilgamesh's damage output in general. Horrific Emblem is also good, which again makes it harder for him to set his combo up, though if I had the choice I would always prefer Heavenly Wings. And that brings us to some playstyle tips. Now one thing is really important. When a Gilgamesh attacks you, do what you do with your GameStop shares and hold your escape. If you use your escape immediately, especially if you use Blink, he's just gonna follow up with his own leap, and then you have no way of getting away from the ultimate. If you're able to somehow survive the initial attacks and maybe even disrupt some of them, and then use your escape once he uses his ult, his follow-up is way weaker. So having just a little bit of patience can really pay off, and in most situations he shouldn't be able to burst you instantly unless he has super squishy guard. If you end up in the circle of his ultimate with no escape, it might sometimes be better to stay in the circle, at least for a little bit. This sounds counterintuitive because the ultimate deals a high amount of extra damage at the end. But the problem is that if you just try to run away from him in a straight line out of the circle, there's a good chance he will catch up to you because you're slowed and knock you back into the middle and then be able to unleash his kit on you very easily. If however you stay around the middle of the circle for a bit and juke his attacks, he'll have a much harder time landing everything on you. Especially if you manage to make him miss his 2, you can use that opportunity to then run away in the opposite direction from where he was dashing, and he might not be able to catch up to you again before you get out of the circle. If you get knocked back while in the circle, it can also make sense to just keep walking in the direction you got knocked back in, because that is usually the point where Gilgamesh is furthest away from then. Obviously this is all a little bit situational, and especially if you're running out with multiple people, he may not even be able to lock you down in the first place, but it can be worth paying attention to what abilities he's already used and how he will try and keep you in the circle. In terms of general positioning against him, you want to go against all traffic laws and stay in the middle of the lane. The further away from the walls you are, the better for you. If you stay around areas with open gaps towards the jungle, that can also help because it means he may have to kick you even further. At the same time, unless your guard has a specific counter, you also don't really want to stand in your wave, because that makes it really easy for him to launch minions into you and stun you with that, which is not necessarily the highest damage but still enough setup for him. So essentially, do a little bit of a dance in the middle of the lane. And also, keep your distance from his tower, because otherwise he can obviously kick you into the tower range, which will hurt you a lot more than his own damage in the early stages of the game. And now let's talk about counterpicks. I'm gonna go through some primary counters and then others that are also just generally doing well against him, a little bit backed up by statistics that I looked into for his general performance against other picks. First of all, one important thing to note is that abilities with cripples don't stop the knockback from his 2. They don't stop him from animating through that. Even though the ability is a little bit of a dash, it is not affected by any crippling abilities at all. Also, yes, generally speaking, hard CC counters him. I always find this a little bit of a cheap cop-out when it comes to countering someone, but in his case it makes a lot of sense, since he doesn't come with a strong CC immunity or strong defensive tools like other warriors do. And that brings us to the gods. Let's begin with the warriors. The first one here is Vamana. Vamana may not be doing all too well at the moment in general, but past level 5 he is an excellent counter to Gilgamesh, so far that even his statistics against him look significantly better than against most other gods. Now, pre-level 5 you definitely have to be a little bit careful with him, but after that, the game's all yours. You have an attack speed and a movement speed slow for a boxing advantage, you have an escape that easily follows up his dash, and your ultimate is the best counter to his ultimate. You can choose to just box him in his own ult and probably not even care, because your duration will be increased long enough for that to work out, or otherwise, obviously the better choice is to just walk out. Gilgamesh is a physical boxer, and Vamana's entire kit is built to counter that. Just make sure to run if he pops Cursed Ankh. Another very good pick is Sun Wukong. His ult similarly allows him to get out of Gilgamesh's ult very easily, and along with that most of his 3 allows him to avoid Gilgamesh's kit. He can also outpoke Gilgamesh from range, so he doesn't have to take the melee fight against him, which means that he will usually bully him in laning phase. And speaking of lane bullies, there is also Tyr. Tyr has 3 different abilities that allow him to get out of Gilgamesh's ultimate very easily, and he also can just run him down in lane with his higher sustain, better defensive stats, and tools to avoid the 2. And even if he gets hit, the stun duration is decreased as well. Being able to juggle Gilgamesh around also means that Gilgamesh's 1 is significantly less effective. The same is true for King Arthur to a lesser extent, who also will just be able to avoid the ultimate very easily with his variety of dashes, and generally has a lot of ways to keep enough distance to Gilgamesh while constantly poking him. A somewhat surprising counter is Nike. On one hand, she can disarm him with her 1, which counters his 1, but she also can make herself knock-up immune with her 2. So if you can time this right, you can give him a very hard time. Chuck is also a pick that performs decently well against him, maybe not the best counter, but he has the attack speed slow in his kit that helps him, he has got a better sustain, he's got a decent way of getting out of the ultimate through either his own ult or through his 1-2 combo, so seems to be doing alright in that way. There are some other picks you can consider like Kukulin, Hercules if you're good with Herc, and then the basic attack solos are typically not doing all too well into him because his basic attack presence is very overwhelming and he can kick them away in any situation where he feels like he's on the losing end. When it comes to assassins, the first one we have to mention here is Loki. Loki can immune Gilgamesh's knockback with his 3, but he also can immune his slows with his 1. That makes for a very nasty combination. The only problem for Loki can be that depending on how tanky the Gilgamesh is, he may not be able to take him down. Against a jungle Gilgamesh he's fantastic, against a solo Gilgamesh you have to specifically counter build him. Similarly, Fenrir has a pretty good time against him, immuning his knockback with his 3, and also having 3 different ways to get out of Gilgamesh's ultimate, while also being able to decently box him through the sustain in his 2. Arachne actually does surprisingly well against Gilgamesh too. That is probably because she can also outbox him pretty well, and she has a slow immunity in her kit and can get out of the ult very easily. At the same time, if she gets knocked back at the wrong time, she would still suffer since she doesn't really have that good of a gap closer. Kali actually does pretty well against Gilgamesh too, probably because she can stun out his knockback and obviously has her knock-up, knockback immunity in her ultimate. If you make it to late game, you can obviously outbox him quite well. Awilish also counters Gilgamesh in multiple ways. On one hand, she can feather stab over his 2 to avoid the knockback, and on the other hand, she has the same immunities in her ultimate as Kali does, which especially means if she pulls in a leaping Gilgamesh, he is kind of out of options. At the same time, if the Gilgamesh is building very tanky, then she needs to build very specifically against him to even burn him within the duration of her ultimate. There are some other picks that should technically do well against him, such as Thanatos with the slow immunity, or Thor with his knockback immunity, but these gods also have certain downsides, such as needing to use their escapes or not even having a non-ult escape in the first place, that make these matchups more situational. In the mage department, we have something similar to Vamana, and that is Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga's ultimate is very similar to Vaman's. She's also usually one of the more tanky mages depending on how you build her, but that extra survivability means that usually a Gilgamesh can't just run her down during her ultimate, like for example a Kali could. You do have to be careful in the early levels though. Shang-Kui actually is a pretty good pick against him as well, because Shang-Kui, during his ultimate, also has knock-up immunity. He should be able to stun out the 2 as well, though with the wind-up that can be very tough to do. Anubis, interesting enough, is a very good pick against Gilgamesh. That's because Anubis gets a knock-up immunity in his 1, while also having the ultimate, which is completely CC immune. So for most of the duration of a fight, if Gilgamesh gets close to him, Anubis will have some way to immune Gilgamesh too. And since his damage and sustain is typically higher than Gilgamesh, that means that he actually has a pretty good matchup. Chang'e is also a solid pick against him because she can use her 2 to either avoid his 2 or get out of his ultimate. Eset is absolutely worth mentioning here as well, since her 1 makes her knockback immune, and her ultimate is something she can just drop into his ult in order to punish him for even using it on her in the first place. Some other picks that do pretty decently are Tiamat, very fitting, Raijin, and Hades. When it comes to hunters, there aren't that many specific counter picks, but some guards that should just generally do decent against him. Chernobog comes to mind simply because through his ultimate as well as his dash he can just avoid a lot of Gilgamesh damage. Apollo, of course, because he can mess the 2 as well as getting out of the ultimate with his ult. And then you have some picks like Chiron, who can, for example, immune the 2 if you put your 1 down very, very quickly. Cupid or Huyi, who can punish him for putting the ult down by just dropping that ult into the ult. Or Ram, who can avoid a lot of his damage, either again through his dash or through his ultimate and just waiting in the air until Gilgamesh's damage runs out. I don't consider most of them direct counters to the same degree as we have in other roles, but they should work out. In the Guardian section, we have some more straightforward counters though. The first one is Kabrakan, who has a slow immunity in his 1, which counters a lot of Gilgamesh's kit, and also can stun him out of his 2 very easily. Cthulhu does not have the best laning phase against him, but otherwise does the same thing that Vamana and Baba Yaga do, pop the ultimate and laugh at pretty much everything he does. Athena does well against him because of the block stacks, but she's also generally just a very strong pick at the moment. Sobek also a strong pick, but will remain a counter no matter what, because displacing Gilgamesh is very painful for him, and Sobek can also immune the ultimate by using his ult. Terra's passive, Standing Stones, allows her to counter Gilgamesh 2 very, very easily because she's very frequently knock-up, knockback immune. Since Gilgamesh mostly relies on bursting a target, Gap and Capri are also relatively good against him. Xingtian has a decent kit to deal with him overall, and Yamaganda is also immune to his knockbacks, though he will take a lot of extra damage, so I wouldn't necessarily say he's a good pick, and he also struggles with the high basic attack damage that Gilgamesh can put out. So as you can tell, there are quite a few different ways to deal with Gilgamesh, you just have to find the one that suits you best. I hope this was helpful. If you're new to the channel, click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at my home gym and contemplate if it's harder for me. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Dwayne Brannon, Lanta25 Green, Zilaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Zifaroli, and everyone else you see here.